Right, Matthew, John mentioned a moment ago that some European countries are among those 8 jurisdictions that have been granted a waiver, and that is a waiver to continue imports of Iranian oil. So in a sense, this has really diluted the impact of sanctions, hasn't it?
I don't think so over the long term. Those waivers are temporary and they will expire, over the next few months is my understanding. So I don't think that's really going to have an impact. I think the main point here is that these sanctions are sending a very clear signal that any company, any country that does business with Iran will face consequences from Washington. And it's not a case of the U.S. being isolated here, as has been suggested. It's actually, I think, impossible to isolate the United States, just given its size, the size of its economy, and the reliance, basically, of most countries on the U.S. in one form or another. It's going to isolate Iran, and I think there's no question about that. And until Iran stops sponsoring terrorism, until it stops its support of Hamas, until it stops threatening Israel, this is going to continue. So I think it's only going to get worse for the Iranian regime, which is the real target of these sanctions, obviously.
Dr. Marandi, is Iran the country that's going to be isolated here?
No, I think that's wishful thinking on behalf of your guest, and I think he greatly hopes that Iranians will suffer, but and they will. Ordinary Iranians will suffer. I'm sure he may get some gratification out of that. But the reality on the ground is that the United States is very isolated.
Matthew, I'll get back to you. Go ahead.
I think many people. I didn't interrupt you, so I think you should have the courtesy to respect other people when they speak. You're not exceptional.
Well, I have to interrupt you if you're speaking your Iranian propaganda on this program, because it's completely
ridiculous. You're just an ordinary citizen. No, that's American propaganda that you're spouting. But the United States is behaving like a godfather. Trump is behaving like a godfather, ordering countries around, dictating terms to them. And I don't think that countries like China or other countries like the Russians, they are going to abide by the sanctions that the United States has dictated to them. And the Iranian, as I said, Iranian oil exports are not going to just go through the old mechanisms. The Iranians are going to export oil through alternative means to companies in Asia especially that do not have direct links with the United States. And the Iranians will be purchasing in alternative currencies like the yuan. And I would add to that the United States doesn't recognize that by using the dollar as a weapon and by using financial institutions as a weapon, just as they've been using ISIS as a weapon in Syria or Al-Qaeda in Syria and so on, after a period of time, these weapons begin to lose their effect. The United States now, it's not just sanctioning Iran, it's sanctioning Russia, it's carrying out a trade war against China, and this has created a very strong incentive to alternatives to SWIFT, to alternatives to the US dollar, and to alternatives to financial institutions that are controlled by the United States.
Okay.
So I think that the Americans are miscalculating, just as in the region they miscalculated by supporting the extremists, and they lost big time along with their allies and the Saudi regime as we see today.
Okay, Matthew, a quick response, please, and then I want to move on.
Well, I would just say, I mean, this is clearly the Iranian propaganda that we're used to here, that the United States is targeting the population, which couldn't be further from the truth. The United States is clearly targeting the regime in Iran, which, as we know, is a terrorist-supporting government. It's a brutal dictatorship, which has been sending hit squads to Europe and elsewhere to kill dissidents. Yeah. All you need to do is to look at what they're doing in the Israeli conflict with the Palestinians and their support of Hamas. So I think it's pretty clear what is at stake here for the United States and for Israel and why this is happening. And I don't think that these sort of pathetic explanations from the Iranian propagandist here are going to change anybody's minds.
Okay, Negar, there we heard it again, that the US is not targeting the Iranian people.
This is not Iranian propaganda. I said that also. This comes from former administration officials during President Obama, even within Washington circles. This has been talked to, that whether it is intended or unintended, the sanctions are going to take a toll on ordinary Iranians. It's been proven. So much literature has come out of this from not the Iranian state, but from credible American research groups. So to claim that the sanctions don't affect the Iranian people is just incorrect, and it's false. But I don't want to discuss the intention.
I didn't say they won't affect the Iranian people. I said they are not the target, and that's an important difference. I'm sorry.
Well,
there's a very important difference between targeting the Iranian people and having an effect. Clearly, they will have an effect.
It has
but the point
been
is that is not
proven
the intention.
Go ahead.
It has been proven that they target the Iranian.
That hasn't been proven at all.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
I think your guest just is interested in interrupting everybody.
Okay, Matthew, I will
prove that it affects.
All right,
them,
Matthew, I will
just
give you a chance to respond to all of this, but you're going to have to let these guests speak. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, you can't prove your point by calling everybody propaganda. So this is going to target the Iranian people. It has targeted them in the past. The effects might not be as much because there's no support, and also to understand the European position, the U.S. is being isolated politically. The fact that this is the biggest and the largest and most powerful economy is going to have some kind of pressure on everybody in the world. Everyone's going to think twice when they have to choose between doing business with the U.S. or someone like Iran. But that doesn't mean that the U.S. hasn't been isolated from its closest allies in Europe politically. The Europeans have come out against the U.S. administration politically as strong as they can, and they're doing everything, it seems, they can to somehow protect this deal economically. Now, if the private companies are going to break from this in Europe, they have other calculations, they do a lot of business with the U.S., that's a different issue. But politically, there has been a clear message coming even from Europe.
John, go ahead.
I think sometimes the danger in these types of conversations, Anand, is we look at these issues in isolation. And from a U.S. perspective, this issue about how sanctions are affecting the everyday society. Yeah. You look at Iran, it's one of two rogue police states on the world stage today. And just the way we are mandating and enforcing the toughest sanctions against the North Korean regime, unfortunately, the people are suffering there, but with a larger goal in mind that hopefully can bring about a different type of society based either on regime behavior change in North Korea or regime change. In Iran, I believe the situation is not to make the Iranian people suffer, but to target the Iranian regime, weaken its underpinnings of support and governance in the country. Unfortunately, people suffer when there are sanctions, but it is not the intention of the U.S. government to have millions of Iranians suffer.
But they will suffer.
Yeah, I am sure Dr. Mohammad Marandi wants to respond to that. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's quite obvious that there's no regime in this world that is more brutal than the American regime. The millions of people who've died in Iraq as a result of sanctions and war, in Afghanistan, the slave trade that we now see in Libya, the U.S. support for the Holocaust in Yemen, the millions of people in Yemen who are dying of starvation thanks to the United States. And in Palestine, the apartheid regime, which is killing people on a daily basis in Gaza, people who are protesting, medics, media personnel are being regularly targeted. Yet the victims are apparently the oppressors and the terrorists in the eyes of these guests of yours. Yes, of course, the intention is the Iranian people. Obama called them crippling sanctions. Your guest cannot hide the term. The U.S. president used the term. Trump calls them brutal sanctions. These are English words that I think your audience is well aware of. But the Iranians are, as we speak, the Iranians and companies, especially Asian companies, are developing Iranian gas platforms. They're developing oil wells. They're developing the south of the country. And it will be more difficult than before, without a doubt. But the world is changing. And as I said, the United States is facing great difficulty because on the one hand, during Obama, it was just Iran that was being sanctioned. Now the United States has imposed very harsh sanctions against the Russians. They're waging economic warfare against China. They're intimidating India. And it's not going to work. And as I said, there are many small companies across the world that want to do business with Iran, and they'll purchase Iranian oil at a cheaper rate, but that oil will be sold. And what will happen is that instead of using the dollars, the Iranians will begin using currencies like the yuan and that will tilt Iran's orientation towards Asia. So effectively, the more the Europeans abide by the sort of thuggish demands of the US government, the more Iran will be tilting to Asia. And in future, when a more reasonable administration comes to Washington, and the Europeans try to regain the market, it'll be very difficult for them to do so.
Matthew, if you look at the impact of these sanctions, we've already talked about the waivers that have been granted by the United States, but now the European Union is also implementing a payment mechanism with Iran to enable its companies to continue doing business with Iran, known as the Special Payment Vehicle, or SPV. I mean, these sanctions, if we look at it, looks a bit like Swiss cheese, doesn't it? Full of holes.
Well, not really, because no companies are using that SPV, as they call it. Any company in Europe with any connection to the United States would be taking a big risk by doing so, and they have no interest in antagonizing the United States, so they're not going to use it. That was very much a face-saving measure on the part of the European Union to show that they weren't going to allow the U.S. to push them around on this front. They were very proud of the JCPOA, which they negotiated for over a decade. It really was a European achievement more than anything, an achievement of European diplomacy, and so they were very disappointed when Trump threw it out. So I don't think that you're going to see anybody in Europe in any large number in terms of corporates doing business with Iran, just the opposite. And it is true that there really wasn't much investment in Iran, but Iran was a big sort of hope for some countries in Europe, especially in the energy sector, that they would be able to make inroads there. And those hopes have now been dashed, and they've also been dashed for the Iranian economy, which has been under a lot of stress already, and, particularly before the JCPOA, which is why Iran agreed to it in the first place. So I think there's no question that in the long term, these sanctions are going to have extreme impact on the Iranian regime.
Negar?
I just want to add that there's also the concern of security. I speak to European officials and diplomats, and security is a very important issue. Iran continuing the nuclear program, or by any means getting close to a nuclear weapons program, or a nuclear weapons, an arms race starting in the Middle East, which is right next to Europe. It's even more concerning to the Europeans from a security perspective, and not just political and principle. This is the reason the Europeans want to preserve the deal. It was the intention of the previous U.S. administration, but it just doesn't seem like President Trump and his administration is going into that direction to try to prevent and keep Iran from getting anywhere close to a nuclear weapons program.
John, we have talked about which side, whether it be Iran or the United States, may be more isolated by this action. But I'm wondering, what kind of message does the United States action send to the rest of the world when it signs an agreement and then breaks it off?
But they did not sign an agreement. Remember this, Anand, okay? As a matter of fact, there was no signature by the Americans or the Iranians, okay? Diplomats agreed to a statement that was ratified by the United Nations. It had zero binding force on the United States government, and several dozen senators in 2015 told the Iranian government, if another administration comes in, be prepared for them to drop the terms of the agreement. We don't think it's good for security.
So you're saying that this agreement had no legal basis?
Zero binding impact on United States government decisions. It was a personal agreement by President Obama with the leaders of European governments and China and Iran at that time that could have been forsaken by a future administration, and it's exactly what happened. And the Iranians were warned about this.
Dr. Marandi, was that Iran's reading of the situation as well?
Well, I think the important thing is that this is not the only agreement that the Americans have pulled out of, and I think they've shown the international community that they have no credibility and that they cannot be trusted, and that's the reason why the Iranians are not going to negotiate with the United States. Because when you negotiate with a country and they sign up to something and then they tear up the agreement, then if in future you have further negotiations, who's to say that they won't tear that up again? So there's really no reason to negotiate with such a regime. And at the same time, the United States is behaving in a brutal manner towards ordinary Iranians. So why should the Iranians trust a regime that is targeting ordinary civilians, that is not abiding by its commitments, that is threatening its own allies, its European allies, and warning them that they will be severely punished if they don't abide by the demands of the United States. This is a rogue regime. When the United States is targeting ordinary Iranians, when the United States surrounds Iran with 45 military bases, and yet it, as I said, tears up its own agreements, why in the world would Iran even wish or even contemplate negotiating with such a regime?
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.